April 29th, 1945.
9:30 a.m.
Outside Munich. The first thing wasn't the sight. It was the smell. It didn't smell like war. War smelled of cordite, wet wool, diesel, and rotting horseflesh. The smell was different. It was sweet, cloying, and greasy. Tasted like copper on the back of the tongue. It was the smell of the incinerator, mixed with the smell of thousands of unwashed bodies living in their own filth. Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks, commander of the 3rd Battalion, 157th Infantry Regiment, the Thunderbirds, sat in his jeep. He was 27 years old, but his eyes looked 50. He had fought from the beaches of Sicily, through the mountains of Italy, and into the heart of Germany. He thought he had seen everything. He thought he had lost the capacity to be shocked. He was wrong. "Colonel," his driver said, pulling a handkerchief over his nose. "What is that?" "I don't know," Sparks said, gripping his carbine. "But we're getting close to Dachau." The orders were simple. Secure the camp. Liberate the prisoners. Capture the SS guards. Simple orders for a complex hell.
10:15 a.m.
The railroad siding. The battalion moved on foot along the railroad tracks leading into the camp complex. The snow was melting, turning the ground into a slurry of gray mud. Then they found the train. It was sitting on a siding, a long line of 39 boxcars. It looked like any other supply train, except it was silent. Dead silent. Private First Class Burdog Johnson, a 19-year-old machine gunner from Oklahoma, walked up to the first car. He was a good kid. He wrote letters to his mother every Sunday. He had never hated anyone in his life, not really. Even the Germans were just targets to him. "Open it up," a sergeant ordered. Burdog slid the heavy wooden door back. The contents didn't spill out. They were tangled together. A mass of limbs, eyes, and mouths frozen in a silent scream. Men, women, children, starved to skeletons, stripped of their humanity, stacked like cordwood. Some had been shot. Some had been beaten. Most had simply starved to death on the 3-week journey from Buchenwald. There were 2,000 bodies on that train. Burdog stared. He didn't vomit. He didn't look away. Something inside him, the little piece of civilization that said, "Thou shalt not kill without cause," snapped. It was a physical sensation like a wire cutting in his brain. He looked at the boy nearest the door. The boy was maybe 12. He was clutching a piece of stale bread in his hand. Even in death, Burdog turned around. His face was pale, but his eyes were black holes. He looked at the other men in his squad. They were all looking at the train. They were weeping. Some were cursing. Others were just shaking. "No prisoners," someone whispered. It wasn't an order. It was a collective agreement. A psychic frequency that rippled through the platoon.
11 a.m.
The gate. They entered the camp. The SS guards were waiting. This was the insult that sealed their fate. The SS men weren't dirty. They weren't starving. They were wearing fresh, crisp uniforms. Their boots were polished. They had just shaved. They looked healthy, arrogant, and well-fed, standing just yards away from the skeletons on the train. SS Obersturmführer Heinrich Skodzinski, the temporary camp commander, walked out toward the Americans. He was impeccably dressed. He wore white gloves. He marched up to Lieutenant Colonel Sparks, clicked his heels, and raised his arm in a salute. "I wish to surrender the camp to the American Army," Skodzinski said in English. "I demand to be treated as an officer under the Geneva Convention." Sparks looked at the white gloves. Then he looked at the chimney of the crematorium, which was still belching smoke. Sparks didn't salute back. He spat on the ground. "Get him out of my sight," Sparks growled to his men. "Put him with the others." A soldier jammed a rifle butt into Skodzinski's ribs and shoved him toward a coal yard enclosed by a high masonry wall. The others were about 50 SS men. Some were camp guards. Some were Waffen-SS soldiers who had been sent from the Eastern Front to surrender the camp. They were lined up against the wall, hands in the air. They looked nervous now. They saw the way the Americans were looking at them. They saw the way Burdog was setting up his .30 caliber machine gun on its tripod.
11:30 am.
The coal yard. The air was electric. The American soldiers, Company I, were shouting at the Germans. "You like killing kids?" one GI screamed. "You like starving people?" The Germans didn't understand the words, but they understood the tone. One of the SS men, a tall blonde sergeant, dropped his hands and took a step forward. Maybe he was trying to surrender. Maybe he was trying to escape. "Stay back!" an American lieutenant yelled. The German took another step. And then it happened. It wasn't a decision. It was a reflex. Burdog squeezed the trigger of the .30 cal.
RATTATTATTATTAT.
The sound was deafening in the enclosed yard. The heavy rounds tore into the line of gray uniforms. Blood sprayed against the white masonry wall. The SS men danced the terrible, jerky dance of death. They fell in heaps. Other Americans opened up with their M1 Garins and carbines. It was a fusillade of pure, unadulterated rage. It was the release of every nightmare they had seen in the last hour. Lieutenant Colonel Sparks was 100 yards away when he heard the firing. He knew instantly what it was. It wasn't a firefight. It was a slaughter. He ran. He ran faster than he had ever run in combat. He burst into the coal yard. "Cease fire!" Sparks screamed. "Damn it, cease fire!" The machine gun kept chattering. Burdog was crying now, tears streaming down his face, screaming as he held the trigger down. He wasn't shooting soldiers, he was shooting the monsters from the train. Sparks didn't wait. He drew his .45 pistol. He ran up to the machine gunner and kicked him in the ribs hard. "Stop it!" Burdog flew backward into the mud. The gun went silent. The silence that followed was heavier than the gunfire. Sparks stood there, chest heaving, his pistol in his hand. He looked at the wall. 17 SS men were dead. Others were writhing on the ground, wounded, moaning in German. The snow was red. Sparks turned to his men. They looked like sleepwalkers waking up from a nightmare. They looked at their smoking rifles, then at the bodies. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Sparks hissed. "We are soldiers, not executioners."
Colonel.
A young sergeant said, his voice cracking. They tried to run. It was a lie. Everyone knew it was a lie. They hadn't tried to run. They had just stood there. Sparks looked at the bodies. He looked at the death train visible through the gap in the fence. He holstered his pistol. "Get the medics," Sparks said, his voice flat. "Patch up the wounded. And nobody says a word about this until I file my report." But it was too late. Standing on the edge of the coal yard, holding a camera, was a brigadier general from the support corps. And next to him was a photographer from the signal corps. The shutter clicked. Snap. The moment was frozen. The bodies. The American soldiers standing over them. The smoking machine gun. The execution of the guards at Dachau was no longer a secret. It was evidence. The evening. By nightfall, the camp was secured. The prisoners were free, though many were dying from the shock of eating the food the GIs gave them. In a command tent set up outside the wire, Felix Sparks sat with his head in his hands. He had liberated Dachau. He was a hero, but he knew what was coming. The photographer had sent the film back to 7th Army headquarters. The brigadier general had filed a complaint. This wasn't just a skirmish. This was a war crime. Technically, under the Articles of War, his men had murdered prisoners of war. The penalty was death by hanging. Sparks looked at his men outside the tent. They were sharing cigarettes, staring blankly at the fire. They weren't murderers. They were boys from Oklahoma and Colorado who had seen the face of the devil and reacted. "I won't let them hang," Sparks whispered to the empty tent. "I'll take the fall." But Sparks didn't know that the report was already moving up the chain of command. It was moving past the division commander, past the corps commander. It was heading toward the one man who hated paperwork more than he hated the Germans. It was heading for George S. Patton. May 2, 1945. 7th Army Headquarters. Augsburg. The war in Europe was ending, but the war of paperwork had just begun. Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Whitaker, the Assistant Inspector General of the 7th Army, sat at a desk that was far too clean for a war zone. In front of him lay a manila folder marked confidential/IG investigation. Inside were the photographs. Whitaker was a lawyer in uniform. He believed in the code. He believed that the difference between the Allies and the Nazis was the rule of law. If Americans started shooting prisoners against walls, then the moral crusade was over. It became just another gang war. He picked up the first photo. It showed a pile of gray-clad bodies at the base of a brick wall. He picked up the second photo. It showed American GIs standing over them, M1 Garand smoking. He picked up the third photo. It showed Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks firing his pistol into the air, trying to stop the madness. "It looks like a firing squad, Joseph," said Colonel Howard, the judge advocate. "Whatever happened at that camp, this isn't combat. This is a mass execution." Whitaker nodded, his face grim. "I want the names. I want the unit. I want the machine gunner. And I want Colonel Sparks." "They claim provocation," Howard said. "They say the guards tried to escape." Whitaker tapped the photo. 17 men don't try to escape by standing in a neat line against a wall while a machine gun is set up 30 feet away. This is murder. Pure and simple. Whitaker stood up. He grabbed his cap. "I'm going to Dachau. I'm going to interview every man in that company. And if the facts fit the pictures, I'm going to hang them." May 3rd, 1945. Dachau. The smell of death had not lifted. If anything, the spring thaw made it worse. Whitaker arrived in a staff car. He walked through the gate, past the Arbeit macht free sign, holding a handkerchief over his mouth. He wasn't there to see the suffering of the Jews. He was there to investigate the conduct of the Americans. He set up his interrogation room in the former SS administrative building. It was ironic. The room still had a portrait of Himmler on the wall, which someone had smashed but not removed. "Send in Lieutenant Colonel Sparks," Whitaker ordered. Felix Sparks walked in. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in a week. His eyes were red-rimmed holes in a face caked with grime. He didn't salute. He just collapsed into the chair. "Colonel Sparks," Whitaker began, opening his notebook, "I am investigating the alleged mistreatment of German prisoners on April 29th. I need you to explain why 17 surrendered soldiers were gunned down by your men." Sparks looked at the lawyer. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a crushed pack of Lucky Strikes, and lit one with a shaking hand. "Did you see the train?" Sparks asked. His voice was a rasp, like sandpaper on stone. "I am asking about the coal yard," Whitaker pressed. "I asked if you saw the train," Sparks repeated, louder this time. 39 boxcars, 2,000 bodies, women, kids. "Did you see the boy with the bread?" "That is irrelevant to the conduct of your troops," Whitaker said coldly. "The Geneva Convention does not have an exception for anger. It does not have an exception for revenge. Did you give the order to fire?" "No," Sparks said. "I stopped it. I kicked the gunner off the tripod. But it happened under your command. You are responsible for the discipline of your men. And according to witnesses, your men were crying and shouting while they did it. That suggests a loss of control." Sparks leaned forward. Smoke curled from his nostrils. "Loss of control?" Sparks laughed, a bitter, humorless sound. "Colonel, my men walked into hell. They saw things that no human being should ever see. And then they saw the demons who did it standing there in polished boots, looking at them like we were the dirt. Something broke. It wasn't discipline. It was their hearts." Whitaker didn't blink. "That is a poetic defense, Colonel. But in a court-martial, it's an admission of guilt. You admit your men murdered unarmed prisoners." "I admit that my men are human," Sparks said. "And if you want to hang someone for that, hang me. Leave the kids alone. Private Johnson, the gunner, he's 19. He's never going to be right again anyway." Whitaker closed the folder. "I intend to recommend a general court-martial for you, Colonel Sparks, and for every man involved in the shooting. The charge will be murder." Sparks stood up. He didn't look scared. He looked relieved. "Do what you have to do," Sparks said. But don't you dare judge them until you've smelled that train. May 5, 1945. The report. Whitaker worked fast. He was thorough. He interviewed the witnesses. He interviewed the photographer. He collected the bullets dug out of the masonry wall. He drafted the document. Report of investigation into alleged mistreatment of German guards at Dachau. It was a masterpiece of legal prosecution. It detailed the timeline. It dismissed the escape attempt as a fabrication. It painted a picture of a rogue unit that had taken the law into its own hands. Conclusion. The killing of the guards was unjustified and constitutes a war crime under the Articles of War. Recommend immediate trial. Whitaker signed it. He felt righteous. He was upholding the honor of the army. He put the report in a sealed envelope and marked it for the attention of General Alexander Patch, commander of the 7th Army. But General Patch was a smart man. When the report landed on his desk, he read it, and his face went pale. He knew what this meant. If this went public, the headlines wouldn't be about the liberation of Dachau. They wouldn't be about the Nazi atrocities. They would be, Americans massacre prisoners. It would give the Germans a propaganda victory in the final days of the war. It would stain the reputation of the U.S. Army forever. Patch didn't want to make the decision. He needed cover. He needed someone higher up, someone with broad shoulders and a terrifying reputation, to take the heat. There was only one man in the European theater who fit that description. General Patch put the Whitaker report into a new envelope. He addressed it to the military governor of Bavaria, General George S. Patton, Jr. May 8, 1945. Patton's headquarters. Regensburg. The war in Europe was officially over. V-Day. But George Patton wasn't celebrating. He was sitting in his office, staring at a map of Russia. He was already fighting the next war in his head. His aide, Colonel Hap Gay, walked in. He was holding the thick envelope from General Patch. "General," Gay said, "this just came from 7th Army. It's sensitive." "What is it? Did someone steal the silverware?" Patton grumbled. "It's an IG report on Dachau, sir. The liberation. Apparently, some of the boys from the 45th Division got a little trigger-happy with the SS guards." Patton took the envelope. He ripped it open. He put on his reading glasses. He read Whitaker's dry, legalistic prose. He looked at the photos of the dead SS men. He looked at the photos of the weeping American boys. Then, he reached into his desk drawer and pulled out another set of photos. These weren't from the investigation. These were the photos taken by his own staff when he had visited the Buchenwald concentration camp a few weeks earlier. Patton remembered the smell. He remembered walking through the barracks at Ohrdruf. Patton, the man of blood and guts. The man who slapped a soldier for crying. The man who loved war. Had walked behind a shed and vomited until his knees shook. He had seen the lampshades made of human skin. He had seen the shrunken heads used as paperweights by the camp commandant's wife. He looked back at the Whitaker report. "Murder," Patton read aloud. "Unjustified." He stood up and walked to the fireplace. A fire was crackling there, warding off the chill of the Bavarian spring. "Hap," Patton said, "have you ever seen an SS guard?" "Yes, sir. Captured a few in the Bulge." "Did they look like soldiers to you?" "No, sir. They looked like fanatics." Patton picked up the photo of the death train that Whitaker had included as context. "This lawyer," Patton said, shaking the report. "This Colonel Whitaker. He thinks war is a courtroom. He thinks you can take a 19-year-old boy, show him 2,000 dead babies on a train, and then expect him to act like a robot when he meets the men who did it. The law is the law, General." Hap Gay played devil's advocate. "If we let them get away with shooting prisoners, we're no better than the Germans." Patton turned, his eyes blazing. "Don't you ever say that," Patton hissed. "Don't you ever compare my men to those butchers. My men kill because they have to. The Nazis killed because they enjoyed it. There is a difference, Hap. It's the difference between justice and the law." Patton paced the room. The Whitaker report felt heavy in his hand. If he signed off on this, sparks would hang. The machine gunner would hang. The 45th Division, the Thunderbirds, would be disgraced. Their heroism in liberating the camp would be forgotten, replaced by a story of a massacre. And for what? For 17 dead SS men? Men who, if they had survived, would have just been hanged at Nuremberg anyway? It's a waste of good rope, Patton muttered. He looked at the report again. He saw the recommendation, General Court-Martial. Patton sat back down at his desk. He took his pen. He hovered over the signature line that would authorize the trial. He thought about the boy on the train with the piece of bread. He thought about the piles of shoes at Buchenwald. He thought about the look in Felix Sparks' eyes in the photo, the look of a man who had tried to do the right thing in a world gone mad. Patton looked at Hap Gay. "Bring me a wastebasket," Patton said. "Sir." "You heard me. Bring me the metal wastebasket." Hap Gay brought the bin over. Patton held the Whitaker report over the bin. "General," Hap warned, "that is an official IG investigation. Copies have been sent to Washington. If you destroy that—" "Washington isn't here, Hap," Patton said. I am the military governor. I am the law in Bavaria." He didn't drop the report. Not yet. He paused. He knew that if he did this, he was committing a crime himself. Obstruction of justice. Destruction of evidence. If Eisenhower found out, if the press found out, Patton's career would be over. He would be remembered not as the hero of the Third Army, but as the man who covered up a massacre. But then he looked at the photo of the SS guards lying in the snow. "Some men," Patton whispered, "don't deserve a trial. They deserve a wall." He looked at Hap Gay one last time. "Hap, bring me my lighter." May 8, 1945. Patton's headquarters. Regensburg. The flame from the Zippo lighter flickered in the drafty room. It was a small, yellow tongue of fire, insignificant against the backdrop of a world that had just spent 6 years burning. General George S. Patton held the corner of the Whitaker report. He watched the flame dance near the paper. "General," Colonel Hap Gay said, his voice tight, "if you do this, there is no going back. That is evidence of a war crime." Patton looked at the photo of the dead SS guards one last time. He looked at their arrogant faces, frozen in the moment before the bullets hit. "Crime," Patton whispered. "Hap, I've walked through the valley of the shadow of death. I've seen what these men did to the world. Killing them wasn't a crime. It was an eviction notice." Patton tilted the paper. The flame caught, started slowly, curling the edge of the page brown, then black. Then the fire took hold. It ate through the legal jargon. It consumed the words murder, unjustified, and court-martial. Patton dropped the burning file into the metal wastebasket. He didn't look away. He watched it burn. The smoke rose, thin and gray, smelling of ink and secrets. He watched until the face of the dead SS officer turned into a flake of black ash and crumbled away. When the fire died down, Patton picked up a heavy brass poker from the fireplace. He stirred the ashes in the bin, breaking up the charred remains until there was nothing left but dust. He looked up at Hap Gay. "What report?" Patton asked. Hap stared at the bin. Then he straightened up. "I don't know what you're talking about, General. I haven't seen any report." "Good," Patton said. "Now get me Colonel Sparks. Tell him to report to my headquarters immediately." May 11, 1945. The encounter. Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks stood outside Patton's office. He was shaking. Not from fear. He had lost the capacity for fear somewhere between Anzio and Dachau, but from a deep, vibrating exhaustion. He knew why he was here. The investigation was over. The court-martial was next. He had already written a letter to his wife, explaining that he was going to prison. He was ready to take the fall to save his men. The door opened. "The general will see you now," an aide said. Sparks walked in. He marched to the center of the room, snapped his heels together, and delivered the sharpest salute of his life. "Lieutenant Colonel Sparks reporting as ordered, sir." Patton was sitting behind his desk. He was wearing his helmet even indoors. He looked like a mountain carved out of granite. He didn't return the salute. He just stared at Sparks with eyes that were pale blue and terrifyingly intelligent. Patton picked up a riding crop and tapped it against the desk.
Top, top, top. Colonel Sparks, Patton growled.
I hear you've been having a hell of a time at Dachau. Yes, sir, Sparks said, staring at the wall behind Patton's head. I hear you had some trouble with the guards, Patton continued. I hear some of them didn't survive the liberation. No, sir, they didn't. Patton stood up. He walked around the desk. He circled Sparks like a shark circling a shipwreck. I have a report here, Patton lied. He picked up a piece of blank paper from his desk. It says your men lost their discipline. It says they butchered prisoners of war. It says you lost control. Sparks swallowed hard. Sir, my men saw things. I didn't ask you what they saw, Patton barked, leaning into Sparks' face. I asked you if you lost control. Sparks looked Patton in the eye. I stopped it, General. I kicked the gunner off the weapon. But I don't regret that they're dead, sir. I can't regret it. Patton stared at him. The silence stretched for an eternity. Then, slowly, the hard lines of Patton's face softened, not into a smile. Patton didn't smile at subordinates, but into something resembling respect. You're a damn good soldier, Sparks, Patton said quietly. Sparks blinked. Sir, I've looked into this matter personally, Patton said, tossing the blank paper back onto the desk. And I have found that there is no evidence to support the charges. Sparks felt the room spin. But the photographs, General. The IG report. There is no IG report, Patton said firmly. It seems to have been lost, misplaced in the confusion of victory. A clerical error. Patton leaned in close. Listen to me, Colonel. You go back to your men. You tell them that they did their job. You tell them that the United States Army is proud of them. And then you tell them to keep their mouths shut. Do you understand me? Yes, sir. Get out of here, Patton said, waving his hand. Go home to your wife, Sparks. You've killed enough Nazis for one lifetime. Sparks saluted. He turned and walked out of the office. As he reached the hallway, he had to lean against the wall to keep from falling over. He was a free man. Inside the office, Patton lit a cigar. He knew he had just broken the law. He knew he had violated his oath. But he took a drag of the cigar and thought of the train. Justice, Patton whispered to the smoke. Sometimes justice is just a bullet. The confrontation with Whitaker. It wasn't over yet. Colonel Whitaker, the lawyer who wrote the report, wasn't going to let it go. A week later, Whitaker stormed into 7th Army headquarters. He demanded to know why the court-martial papers hadn't been filed. He demanded to know where his report was. He was told that General Patton had handled it. Whitaker was furious. He drove to Regensburg. He demanded a meeting with Patton. He didn't get a meeting. He got a message delivered by Hap Gay. The general says he is busy, Gay told the fuming lawyer. He also says that if you continue to harass his combat officers about dead SS men, he will have you transferred to the Aleutian Islands to count penguins. Whitaker tried to go over Patton's head. He sent a memo to Eisenhower. But Eisenhower, sitting in Frankfurt, looked at the memo. He knew what Patton had done. He knew George had covered up a massacre. He closed his eyes. He thought about the political fallout. He thought about the press. And then he thought about the camps. Eisenhower picked up a stamp-marked file. He stamped the memo and threw it into the deepest archive of the U.S. Army. Let it go, Ike told his staff. George is right this time. The world doesn't need to know. Epilogue: The Ghost of the Coal Yard. George Patton died 7 months later, the secret of the burning wastebasket safe with him. Felix Sparks went home. He became a lawyer, then a judge, and eventually a brigadier general in the National Guard. He lived a long, honorable life. But every night, for 50 years, he saw the train. And he saw the wall. The secret held for decades. The Dachau massacre was a rumor, a whisper among veterans. But history has a way of rising from the ashes. In 1991, a researcher in the National Archives found a misfiled box. Inside was a carbon copy of the Whitaker report, the copy Whitaker had kept for himself, hidden away all those years ago. The photos came out. The testimony came out. The world finally saw what had happened in the coal yard. Historians debated it. Was it a war crime? Yes, technically. Was it murder? Yes, legally. But when they interviewed the surviving veterans of the 45th Division, none of them apologized. One of them, an old man who had been a 19-year-old private on that day, told a reporter, "You weren't there. You didn't smell it. You didn't see those kids piled up like wood. We killed the guards. And if I had to do it again, I'd kill them twice." And somewhere in the great beyond, George Patton was smiling. He had burned the paper, but he couldn't burn the truth. He had simply bought his men enough time to live their lives before the judgment of history caught up with them. And to Patton, that was the only victory that mattered. The end.